All right, welcome back. This will be the final lecture on the chapter on labor supply. So you know the drill by now, so let's jump right back in and get started. So we use the concept of elasticity in economics. Elasticity is basically just the responsiveness in one variable to the change in another variable. So in this case, the elasticity of labor supply measures the responsiveness in hours worked to changes in the wage rate. So if something is elastic, we say that it's responsive to a change. And if it's inelastic, then it's not responsive to a change. So looking at the elasticity of hours worked compared to changes in the wage rate, we can write this as an equation. So we can do that using the percent change in hours worked, so percent delta H, divided by the percent change in wages, or percent delta W. When the labor supply elasticity is less than 1, the labor supply is said to be inelastic. When this happens, the hours worked respond less than the wages in percentage terms. On the other hand, if the labor supply elasticity is greater than 1, then we call it elastic. So the hours worked will respond even more than the changes in wages. Now, your textbook walks through a good example of women's labor force participation in section 2.9. It considers household or the household as the economic unit, with a husband and wife choosing to specialize and allocate time towards the household and to the labor market. Provides a good analysis of the budget lines for both members and their utility function. And although we won't have enough time to have a full discussion here, I do recommend you reading it and working through the implications on your own. That I think will be a helpful exercise. I'll prepare you for some of the assignments that we'll be doing this week. So now let's work through the second example provided by the textbook. This one is in section 2.11. There's been a long debate on whether welfare programs impact individuals' decisions to work or not. So let's look through our very simple model using the neoclassical labor leisure decision model and see what implications we can get from that. So let's start with a simple example. So for this one, the government begins a program where they provide a $500 cash grant each week to an individual who's not in the labor force. So they can't be employed and they can't be actively looking for a job. So in this example, the U0 utility curve represents the utility curve for when an individual does not receive a grant. So you can say this is before the program begins, or if they decide not to leave the labor force to receive the grant. The initial budget line is the line FE that comes down here diagonally, and is based on whether the indifference curve, or where the indifference curve is tangent to this budget line, will determine where they're willing to work. So in this case, it's point P, where U0 is tangent to that line. In this case, they'll prefer 70 hours of leisure per week, which for this example corresponds to 40 hours of labor because there's 110 total hours that they're considering. Now, once the cash grant program goes into effect, if the individual opts in to receive that cash grant, this changes the choices available for the individual. So in the past, they could not have moved beyond the utility curve U0. That was the best that they could do at this tangent point P. But now they can receive the $500, which allows them to move out to point G. So right here is the $500 that they can receive. So we draw a straight line out from here. It can go as far out to the 110 hours of leisure, but it can go no farther than that because that's how many hours there are in the week. In this case, I think they're excluding time to sleep each night. So they can go all the way out to this utility curve U1 at point G. Now, why doesn't this look like an increase in non-labor income, which just moves the endowment point up? In the past, we would have the endowment point here up to G at that $500, and then a line going up parallel to EF. Well, the reason why we don't have that in this case is that the individual here can either choose to receive the grant and not work, or they can work. So for this case, they're going to end up being two separate lines. We'll see the next example where they are able to work and receive the grant, in which case it will have the normal line that we've seen in the past. But in this case, it is one or the other. So that's why they're separated here. Now, I don't want to get too bogged down in the details, But what does this model show us will be the result of this program? In this case, using this very simple analysis, this individual will choose to exit the labor force and to remain outside of it in order to receive the $500 grant. For them, they can maximize their utility here at point G. Again, we're farther out than the original utility curve here at U0. That's what maximizes their utility. So $500 of consumption, which is what they receive for that grant, and then 110 hours of leisure, the full week of leisure. Working at the available wage rate is not going to provide enough utility to be a better option than dropping on a labor force and receiving that grant. Now, of course, in practice, this may not always be the case. The individual might be thinking about the future, knowing that maybe this is better in the short term, but longer term, they'll be able to get some raises, maybe use that experience to find a new job. So it'll end up being worth it in the long run, even if it isn't today. I do a lot of work with labor market regulations and helping state legislatures craft better, more effective, and less costly regulations. Part of my job is considering negative consequences of policy, so like this case right here, and comparing it to the benefits that they receive. So the work discouraging nature of this policy, in this example here, is undeniable. But if we are trying to, like in my job, trying to work with policymakers to determine what is the optimal policy to do, what is the best form, trying to determine if this specific policy is worth it or not, you have to count both of these costs, which are incredibly important, and the benefits to determine whether or not it's worthwhile. So that's why this type of